Chairman Pillay, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. It provides me enormous delight to welcome you all to this segment of today's event, the panel discussion following the launch of Professor Riaz Hassan's seminal tome on the sociological explorations of the subject Islam and society. I should be, as you have heard, I am the moderator and not a speaker, but I will make some remarks. And it would be frightfully remiss of me were I to begin my remarks without commending this outstanding piece of work that was launched today. The seven essays that the book contains holds forth the thesis in a lucid manner, I think, and as a result of impeccable research conducted, stating that the sacred religion inclusive, is a socially constructed reality and not a transcendental supernatural phenomena. Though it could also be argued that the broad societal implications that we shall discuss flow from the interplay of the two. That is, the interplay of the fact that it's a social construct and at the same time a transcendental supernatural phenomena in the perceptions of some. The intermingling of religion and politics, the church and the state, that is, have shaped the manner in which human polities, civic societies, have been organized for centuries. And this despite Jesus' early urgings that one must render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. The problem was that the powerful secular entity, that's Caesar, that's the state, often sought to control what was not just his due, but also to usurp what was owed to God. In fact, historically, predating both Islam and Christianity, rulers used religion and the spiritual to justify their temporal authority. The ancient Greeks turned to the oracles. Roman emperors were declared divine when they passed away. In fact, it's said that at the moment of his demise, the Emperor Vespasian, he mournfully, ruefully observed, "Alas, I'm about to become a god." So, European monarchs claimed their right to divine rule, and Chinese emperors were said to receive their mandate from heaven. The caliphs of Islam used to see themselves as the Amirul Mu'mineen, which is the commander of the faithful. Now, in Europe, four developments undercut the role of religion. And these were the Reformation, the French Revolution, the Age of Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution. So instead of religion, what came to the fore as a result of these events was ideas and ideologies: secularism, conservatism, nationalism, socialism, fascism, and the like. And ideas ruled the world and its events, declared the mighty Giuseppe Mazzini. While the colonial East did not give birth to such ideologies, many leaders of the independence movements, and including South Asia, which we will discuss, the region that will be the focus of our attention today, were inspired by these ideologies. But with the passage of time, the power of ideologies somewhat eroded, receded into the background, as many of the colonies began to discover their roots, and religion made a comeback. Fundamentalism stressed early religious practices and strict interpretation of sacred text as a basis, not just of religion, but of politics as well. For example, political Islam, which is now referred to as Islamism, to distinguish it from Islam as broadly practiced. Somewhat like Christianity, we all know of the schism in Christianity that followed the Reformation. In Islam too, there was a schism. Shiite ideology found even in Iran, and Sunnis in much of the rest of the world, Muslim world, including large tracts of South Asia. Among some Sunnis, the extremist Salafist variant evolved. Salaf means ancestors, whose central belief is that the earliest Muslim community of the 7th century Arabia was the most ideal society. South Asia, with its rich tapestry of varied cultures, provides the matrix on which thrive some of the major religious movements anywhere: Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. And as a result of the intermingling of these sets of beliefs, Islam turned out to be synthetic or tolerant, though in India a more conservative Deobandi school, as you have heard, appeared, as opposed to the more liberal Brelvis or Sufism, as Professor Hassan explained a little while ago. Nonetheless, generally speaking, the Quranic injunction broadly followed was, and I shall cite it in Arabic, lakum dinukum waliyadin, which means you follow your faith and I shall follow mine. Elements of each major South Asian religion morphed over time for a variety of reasons into forces that today, unless properly managed, could destabilize the societal fabric. In Islam, the emergence of the Taliban, for instance, they say, the Talib that is, their mission is to cure the social malaise, in which case we have far more reason to fear the doctor than the disease. The flip side of the Talib terror is the emergence of a new type of Muslim hero, not the rugged, weather-beaten warrior, but the gentle 16-year-old Malala of Mingora, who, as some think, will be the next Nobel Peace Laureate. The destructive energy of extremism can be converted to social good if properly channeled in the right direction, and therein lies the litmus test of future progress of this Muslim majority societies. Now, to debate and discuss this and more, we have today an extraordinarily talented trio, which excludes the moderator, but includes the gentleman to my left who's yet to arrive. We have Mr. Javed Barki, an economic thought leader who needs no intro, and the well-known NUS sociologist Syed Farid Alatas, who will join us soon, apart from our very distinguished author, Professor Riaz Hassan. And I shall begin by handing over the microphone to Professor Hassan for the next 10 minutes or so. Yeah.
I think I'll probably not take all my time. I'll perhaps come back. But let me just develop my fundamental, one of the fundamental points I want to make. It is very common in public mind that whenever people want to explain events that are taking place in Muslim world, they always assume that the Muslim behavior and Muslim thought is entirely motivated by impulses of Islamic theology. Here's an example. a couple of years ago, a few years ago, I was invited, because I had been working on suicide terrorism in Australia for 5 years. And the Prime Minister and Cabinet Office asked me to come over. And there was a closed door in Australia, in Canberra, to talk to discuss problem of Muslim radicalism in Australia. And the people, the participants, were almost all of them were very senior public servant or police officers. And I was the only one who was a Muslim and non-European. And I heard with considerable interest and patience how everyone tried to explain, without mentioning that they were talking of Islamic radicalism, how to contain radicalism in Australian society. And they concluded that Australia, that to control, to do something about Islamic radicalism in Australia, we should have liberal imams. And that is how the discussion progressed, that we should really now, the government should adopt a policy of having liberal imams who would be then installed in various mosques in Australia. We have about 500,000 Muslims in Australia, and then that would probably solve the problem. And then I raised the issue, I said, could somebody tell me where are we going to find these liberal imams? And secondly, when we find them, how do we know the young people will go and listen to them? Because most young people probably have alternate ways of actually going and finding about religion. And in fact, internet is considered to be one of the very important sources, and other social media technologies as well. Anyway, basically, the discussion evolved, and I suggested to them that perhaps we should look at the fact that the reason why there could be radicalism among Muslim youths in Australia is not because of the impulses of Islamic theology. Now our missing third panelist has arrived. And that it could not be the impulses of Islamic theology, but impulses of inequality in Australia that could actually play a role in radicalizing the Muslim youth. And I gave them statistics from the census. Young Muslim, 15 to 19-year-old, who are born in Australia, educated in Australia, had an unemployment rate which was 26%, whereas the Australian-born, non-Muslim Australians had unemployment rate of 12%. The employment participation rate of Muslims was low, unemployment rate was high, and so the inequality, in fact, 40% of Muslim children live in poor families, household ownership, and all this household ownership was lower among Muslims and non-Muslim Australians. So I put out a catalogue of inequalities that the Muslim community, the profile of the Muslim community, in spite of the fact that the Muslims in Australia constitute one of the most educated segments of society. 21% of the Muslims in Australia are graduates of the university, whereas the overall population of the non-Muslim Australians is around 14%. And high school participation rate, etc., much higher. So while the educational credentials were very high, very creditable, but the labor market response to those creditable educational credentials did not correspond to those credentials. And so my point is, before we go and look for liberal imams, maybe we could, I suggested that maybe we should try to institute policies which could actually provide opportunities for young Muslims to find jobs, meaningful activities, recreation, etc. So this is just one example how in the public discourse, in one of the most democratic and stable democracies, when we talk about, and very intelligent people, when they talk about Islam, they talk as if Muslim behavior can only be motivated entirely by impulses of theology. My position is this, let me just state it very loud and clear. It is the impulses of society which drives Muslim behavior just like it drives every other behavior of every other community. Let me give you perhaps another, I could develop, fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is a modern movement, which actually, a modern intellectual movement in Islam, in Muslim countries. And my explanation is this, that for 13th century after the foundation of Islam, until about the beginning of the 20th century, most Muslims believed on, were taught to believe one religion, one culture hypothesis. That if you are Muslim, somehow you are going to become formally foundational culture of Islam. With the advent of transport technology, with the development of transport technology and communication technology, we suddenly, Muslim intellectuals began to realize that Muslims everywhere are not the same. They're different. In Indonesia, men and women sit next to each other, shake hands, and feel very comfortable. This is totally unacceptable in Saudi Arabia. In Bosnia, the intermarriage between Muslim and non-Muslims is very significant. And in 7 countries that I have studied, Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, Egypt, Kazakhstan, Iran, and Turkey, the Muslim party, for example, the moderate Muslim party is found in Kazakhstan. Reason? Because they have been under communist rule for 80 years, 90 years, and which basically disestablished religion. And after that, what surprised me was the most moderate religious party, religious commitment, was in Turkey, which has been a secular country for many decades, in the 20th century. And the second country, which was very similar to Turkey, was Iran, which actually was quite interesting because Iran is a theocratic state, whereas Turkey is a secular state. And the more orthodox religiosity was found in Indonesia, Malaysia, Egypt, and Pakistan. And I think my explanation of fundamentalism is that basically that the intellectuals, Muslim intellectuals who thought that Islam is going to create a homogenized sort of culture and society, certainly found that that was not the case. That Muslims actually, Muslim identity, Muslim culture, Muslim society are hybrid societies. They are not like all societies. And it was the reaction to hybridity that actually gave rise to fundamentalism, to return to some kind of puritanical version of Islam, which actually nobody knows what it is. I had a number of other examples, but maybe I'll stop here. But basically, my thesis is this, that it is the impulses, it's the social factors, impulses of society which determine not only religious expression of religiosity in Muslim countries, but also Muslim behavior and its practice of Islam. And I think it would be very important for us to begin to understand the social factors that influence the practice of Islam and the Muslim social life in order to understand why Muslims do what they do.
Mr. Javed Berkey, the microphone is yours for the next 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's hard to beat your sartorial elegance and the elegance of your language, but I do my best. Listening to Chairman Bilay when he started this session, I was struck by 2 points that he made. The first one was, and he said that with a sense of worry, that the Islam he came across has changed. And I think he said that with a sensible way. When I read Hassan's book, not just this one, but several others that he has written, he would like to celebrate the fact that there is in Islam the capacity to change. And the examples that he was giving a minute ago, including the story of his Kazakh drinking buddy who was also eating pork, is that Islam is able to sustain, should be able to sustain a lot of differences as long as its basic tenets are not seriously violated. I was also struck by Chairman Pilay's second comment, which is that the little bit that he's got to know about Islam, he began to see that this is a religion with a very strong socialist reading or interpretation. And as an economist, somebody who's student of that subject and has practiced that subject for a long time, it is that aspect of Islam which I would like to focus after making some preliminary comments. How would I apply the book's most important findings to the world of economics at this time? I have at least two answers to this question. Before I get to those, I will quote from a long essay written by the late anthropologist Clifford Geertz for the New York Review of Books. The article was published in two parts, and it reviewed 13 books on various aspects of Islam that were published after 9/11. The books reviewed included Professor Hassan's earlier work, Faith Lines, Muslim Perceptions of Islam in Society. It was one of the few that won a favorable comment by Geertz. Geertz was very critical about most of the other books that he reviewed. And he says something about Professor Hassan's modesty, that if I had been in his place and if a book that I had written had been applauded by the likes of Paul, some famous economist, I would have shouted from the rooftops. But it took me a long time to get Hassan to recognize that his work has really been given a great reading by one of the world's greatest anthropologists. Geertz talked about Islam, worked as an anthropologist in a number of Muslim countries, and began to understand the religion from many different perspectives. Working at ISAS, I have begun to realize how different disciplines function, how they gather knowledge, how they spread their knowledge. And I'm impressed by the fact that now sitting very close to a sociologist, his room is next to mine, so sometimes I can hear his labors. Sociologists have a very, very strong belief in doing survey work, in asking real people real questions, in trying to find out what they really believe in. And that's the most attractive part of Hassan's work that I have seen, in the fair amount of which I have by now read. Geertz asked the question that why was there such a great deal of interest in Islam? His answer, we are in this country right now engaged in the process of constructing rather hurriedly, as though we had better get on with it after years of neglect, a standard public image of Islam. The United States was the country to which Clifford Geertz was referring. And as you know, Americans are always trying to catch up with things as they pass them by. And understanding of Islam was one of those areas on which they began to focus rather belatedly. Until very recently, Geertz wrote, we had hardly more than the suggestions of such an image. Islam was seen as a society of vagrant notions of stallions, harems, deserts, palaces, azans, and chants. Have the books changed the perception? Not by much, was Clifford Geertz's answer, but he found some exceptions to his disappointment. One of them, Professor Hassan's book, which looked at really existing Islam rather than some schematized and tendentious image of it. In the book launched today, Professor Hassan continues with the line of research he has followed in several other previous works. He has studied the attitude of Muslim societies across the globe to pick out the essence of the religion they follow, and in the case of many, practice on a daily basis. His several conclusions are worth recalling. The first one is very important to understand, because that also could be a source of tremendous amount of confusion and controversy in some of the more religious lands in the world, as well as more religious communities that we have today. He says, and I hope I am reflecting his opinion well, with some understanding, the religion was defined by its prophet Muhammad in terms of what Professor Hassan calls the Arab historical memory. Its message was embedded in the stories which the Arab population was familiar with. Muhammad's earlier detractors called him a rehasher of old tales. But as Professor Hassan explains, the stories were not important in themselves. The content of the message should be separated from the parables that were used to convey it. That message is not very different from the one that has become the basis of universal human rights. The book's second message is what was advocated as a way to practice the religion of Islam was not meant to be frozen in time. And this is where this business about change comes in, and I look at it in a positive sense, and so does the author. Islam, especially in the way it is interpreted in relation to the form a Muslim state should take, and the laws it should put on the books, and the way they were supposed to be enforced, were all matters that were meant to remain current with the times. That is to say, the religion was expected to change, both in the way it was understood and also in the way it was practiced. Obscurantism should not have become the defining aspect of the religion, as it has in the case of some of the states that have declared themselves to be Islamic republics. This was particularly the case with the short-lived Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. If the Taliban were to regain power and become participants in some form or other for exercising that power, what principles of statehood would they pursue? The answer to this question will determine not only where Afghanistan goes after December 2014, when the Americans finally pull out their troops. It will have enormous consequences for the western part of the world of Islam. So it is my hope, and some of the work three of us have begun to do now, that this message we will be able to communicate through our writings as Afghanistan begins to find its way. The book's third message follows the logic of the second. In determining the interaction between the state and the citizenry, Islamic practice was meant to remain current. This is necessary for several reasons. This must occur in order to deliver to people what they want from the state. It is also important to correct the way the religion practiced by more than 1.5 billion people, more than a fifth of the world's population, is perceived by the rest. Increasingly, contacts between the followers of Islam and the citizens of world's rich nations will increase. Western Europe now has a significant number of Muslims living in their midst. Of the 200 million people who have left their homes and settled in foreign lands, more than a fourth, or 50 million people, are Muslims. And there is now a daily contact between Islam and other religions in Europe and in North America. The most important message in Hassan's work, and I say that from the perspective of my discipline, which is economics, is what he refers to as the sociology of Islam. He presents a number of insights into the way Islam is perceived in various parts of the world, and he has referred to some of those when he was talking about Kazakhstan, Iran, and Turkey. This insight is not new. It was the basis of the work done decades ago by the anthropologist Clifford Geertz. He studied Islam and it was followed in two societies that were at the opposite end of the Islamic arc, Indonesia and Morocco, and saw how different were these two communities, one from the other. Professor Hassan's work follows this tradition, but by the use of carefully constructed and conducted surveys that go deeply into the attitudes of the people towards the religion so many people follow, his findings deepen what some of his intellectual predecessors, such as Geertz, set out to do. Hassan's work questions the conclusions reached by such influential books as Samuel P. Huntington's The Clash of Civilization and Bernard Lewis's What Went Wrong. There will not be world-shaking clash as Huntington had envisaged. Neither has Islam gone on the wrong route, as Lewis had argued. Islam, as Hassan points out in convincing detail, is not a monolithic system of beliefs. This brings me to the economist view of the work done by Professor Hassan. By separating the main message from the dogma, we begin to see the relevance of the religion's core beliefs from a lot that has accreted around it. In the world being endlessly shaped and reshaped by capitalism and globalization, two issues have come to the front which need to be addressed and need to be stressed. The first relates to the capitalist system's total reliance on using the forces of the market to allocate resources in the most efficient way. This invariably results in increasing income inequality, both personal and regional. And we heard Professor Hassan give an example of what's happening to the Muslim youth in Australia. Economists have begun to accept that these income gaps need to be narrowed. And the most effective way of doing this is to have the state step in. But what should the state do? The current debate in the United States on the future of the health system and the role of the state in ensuring that the system covers all citizens has created bitter social and political divides. It has also pitched those who have a great deal against those who have very little. This is the real clash that is threatening to bring down the economic, political, and social structures built with so much pain, blood, and sweat by the West. This clash has resulted in closing down the government in the United States, since a powerful segment of the population is not in favor of using their tax dollars to provide health coverage to the poor. Islamic teachings make taking care of the poor and the disadvantaged a religious obligation. Or should that be done is left to be determined by individuals within Muslim communities. An Islamic state following the teachings of the religion need not be theocratic. All that it needs to ensure is that the sense of humanity it advocates is given the opportunity to express itself in terms of personal action. Some of those who governed in some parts of the Muslim world believed that the requirement that a part of the accumulated wealth should be used for assisting the poor needed to involve the intervention of the state. This was done by the government headed by General Ziaul Haq of Pakistan, which made the payment of zakat mandatory for the country's citizens. After a great deal of debate, the original Zia intent was considerably diluted. As currently practiced, the zakat is now levied only on the savings in the banks and only enforced on the Sunnis. The Shia community is exempt. A number of Islamic scholars interpret the provisions with respect to zakat in terms of personal obligation to be met by individuals themselves without intervention by the state. The second relevance of Islamic teachings for economics is in the area of cross-border trade. In the early days of the development of the Muslim state, trade followed freely among different communities. Obstacles came to be placed in its way when the European powers developed the mercantilist approach. It has been difficult to move away from this nationalist approach to trade. By seeing the Islamic community as being largely indivisible, it should be possible to develop a system of trade and exchanges that overcome nationalistic approaches. Some essentially half-hearted attempts have been made to build a trading system among the Muslim countries on the basis of Islamic practices. At one of the meetings of the Organization of Islamic Organization, the idea of creating a free trade zone among Muslim states was viewed with some interest but has not led to anything significant. In sum, Professor Hassan's book advances our understanding as well as our view of Islam by giving it an interpretation that makes it relevant for the modern world. Thus practiced, we can keep the world away from what Huntington saw as the inevitable clash of civilizations. The book's debut is at the right moment when the global system is in a state of unprecedented flux.
Thank you. We are getting into an increasingly interesting eclectic treatment of the book and the subject. I mean, I sought to place it on the backdrop of political, historical context. You naturally drew out the sociological and the thrusts of Islam, and you gave it the economic treatment. So broadly, I mean, this was the purpose of this seminar, to address the total implications of Islam for South Asia. And you note that there's an element of globalization in this, because ultimately we haven't discussed the politics of state in Islam. I mean, whether the Ummah covers both of the territorial states, so that is entirely different subject. But at some point in time, I believe during the Q&A session, that will come up. I will now give the floor to Professor Alatas for the next 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm of course not qualified to speak about the implications of this topic for South Asia. I'm not an expert on South Asia. But I would like to say something about the significance of the sociological approach that has been adopted by Professor Riaz Hassan. As you all know, Professor Riaz has, in many of his works, and I would say more in the latter half of his career rather than the earlier part, focused on the sociology of Muslim societies. And I would like to stress that these works are not merely works about Muslim society, but they are works that take a decidedly sociological approach to the study of Muslim society. There are many books and research papers written about Muslim societies, but they don't necessarily take a sociological approach. So in that sense, Professor Riaz's work, you could say, is part of a long tradition of sociological kind of work on Islam, but it is a tradition that has not taken root in contemporary Muslim societies and even in contemporary social sciences. Some of the authors from that tradition were already mentioned, Ernest Gellner, Clifford Geertz, but we can even go further back to refer to Ibn Khaldun. So these are works that ask sociological questions, that deal with broad-ranging macro issues of society. And this approach hasn't really taken root in social sciences. And I'd like to say more about that. Before that, though, let me just make one point. It's very common in our interactions with students and I think this is also true of the public in general, and this is true among Muslims as well as Christians. At least that's my experience in this part of the world. It is very common to come across the view that the sociological approach is irreligious, is against religion. For example, if you explain the rise of Islam or the rise of Christianity in sociological terms, when I say sociological terms, I mean you are explaining a phenomenon in terms of the role of social factors. So, for example, you may explain the rise of Islam in terms of the social factors that we find during that period. For example, the fact that there was a great deal of social cohesion among certain tribal groups, which and then Islam was able to play the role of cementing the various tribal cohesion, the various tribal groups. If you give an explanation of the rise of Islam in terms of social factors, it is as if you are denying the role of God. You are denying the role of revelation. I think it's often not understood by people that the sociological analysis can supplement or can be harmonized with a theological explanation. It is like saying that God works within the context of the laws, whether scientific laws, natural laws, or even sociological laws. I mean, for example, God could have, for believers, right? Believers would believe that God could have easily revealed Islam in the Chinese language to the Arabs, and God could easily make, the Arabs certainly could have easily made the Prophet understand Chinese. After all, he's God. But God doesn't do that. He doesn't, break the laws that He created. In other words, revelation takes place within a certain social and geographical context and harmonizes with that. So, as Professor Riaz says, you have this Arab historical memory, which is the context in which the revelation takes place. But then, I think he goes on to stress that although the revelation and the doctrine is homogeneous, and one could add that it has retained a remarkable degree of homogeneity and has been quite resilient in the sense that it hasn't changed much in terms of the basic doctrines of Islam over the centuries. Although that has happened, at the same time, Islam has been concretized in different ways, in different societies, in different cultures. So you have a broad variation in terms of the culture and the practice of Islam, as Professor Riaz points out in many parts of his of this book, Islam and Society, but also in the earlier works. He mentioned the example of shaking hands. You don't have to compare the Middle East and Southeast Asia, or South Asia, but even within Southeast Asia, you find a great deal of variation. So much so it's become a problem, I don't know when to shake hands and when not to shake hands. So I think I don't shake hands anymore unless a lady gives her hands to me. I'm talking about ladies, women who are veiled. In Sudan, it is very common for women who are veiled, conservative women, to give their hand to men. It's not an issue. But in other parts of the world, it's a great issue, and a big issue, and you'll find that women will not extend their hands, even if a man puts his hand out. But this is just one example, and you can find so many examples covering all aspects of life. And I think Professor Riaz's earlier work on faith lines, in which his couple of books in which he conducted extensive surveys in various parts of the Muslim world, show that variation. What is maybe more interesting is the counterintuitive results of his studies. For example, he just said just now, he was comparing Malaysia and Indonesia with Iran and Turkey. I think many people would not have thought that the Islamic that you would find a less than conventional or less than orthodox outlook in Iran as compared to Malaysia or Indonesia, but that certainly is the case. Now, this sociological approach is a very important approach, and the lack of it, I think, explains a number of situations, a number of problems that we find in Islamic studies today. For example, Ibn Khaldun, who is a very important progenitor of the social sciences, is hardly ever discussed from a sociological perspective. The fact that we have very few sociological studies on Islamic society is, I think, a reflection of this lack of what we might call, what C. Wright Mills calls a sociological imagination, at least as far as Islamic studies is concerned. Now, Professor Riaz mentioned fundamentalism or extremism. That's, I think, a very good case in point. The study of extremism in Muslim society is generally confined to political and security studies, with far fewer works done on the topic from a sociological point of view. At the same time, extremism is causing havoc throughout the Muslim world. So there's a gap, there's a lag between what is actually happening in society and studies in sociology and indeed other social sciences on these problems. I just came back from Greece. This is where my excuse for coming late comes in, jet lag and all that. Maybe I don't look jet lag. But when one is desperate, one has to fumble around for excuses. But anyway, there was Rhodes. I came from this forum called the Rhodes Forum on Rhodes Island in Greece, where there was a long plenary session on the Sunni-Shiite conflict in the Muslim world today. Now, this is largely a problem that had been started by Salafis. There is a Salafi movement, a global Salafi movement that has been gathering momentum. It has come to Malaysia in a very big way, and it has resulted in a hate and smear campaign against Shiites, in which the press, or certain individuals in the press, has even talked about the eradication of Shiism. In Malay language, they say menghapuskan Shia, but in the English press, it's referred to eradication of Shiites. Now, this discourse has also come to Singapore, but because of the tightly controlled nature of the press, we don't see it in the press, but it is all over cyberspace. Yet, there's very little official discourse about it, and there's very little discourse among in academia. It is probably paid attention to by people in security studies, and it is paid attention to if it becomes a security problem. But it is more than a security problem. It is a problem of the social and cultural life of Muslims in this region, and it ought to be discussed from cultural and sociological perspective. So, while I would say that sociological works such as those of Professor Riaz Hassan are extremely important and welcome, it is unfortunate that they are one of the very few. And it is unfortunate that we don't seem to be at a point where we are nurturing such a tradition through programs, through scholarships, through graduate studies programs. And I think this is certainly true of this part of the world. It is also true of the Middle East, and in fact, I believe it is also true of South Asia, where there are very few. In fact, I only know one program in Hyderabad University where there is a study and research program from a sociological point of view. This is at Hyderabad University, but I don't believe that there are such programs in other parts of South Asia. So Islam continues to be a preoccupation of people either in Islamic studies, in traditional Islamic studies, or in security studies. So it is a tradition that should not stop with Professor Riaz Hassan. While his works are valuable in and of themselves, it will be a pity if people do not take his works. People should not take his works just as the study of Muslim society, but as an approach, as a sociological approach that, as he himself says in his works, are inspired by people like Ibn Khaldun, Ernest Gellner, Clifford Geertz. I also would like to add my late father, Syed Hussain Alatas, was a close friend of Professor Riaz. And of course, I met Professor Riaz through my father. I was, I don't know, I must have been 7 or 8 years old, so I barely had any understanding of the significance of the sociological approach. But I do remember in those days that Professor Riaz was studying suicide. And he was studying suicide in Singapore. And it was groundbreaking, path-breaking work for Singapore sociology. Now, I hope that what happened to suicide studies in Singapore will not happen to the sociological study of Islam. Because although Professor Riaz started that, what could have become a tradition did not take off as far as Singapore sociology is concerned. Although suicide is a very significant phenomenon in Singapore society. But yet, the sociological study of suicide in Singapore, in Malaysia, in the region, has not become an important field of study, despite the work that Professor Riaz did in the 1960s and 70s. I hope that does not happen to the sociological study of Islam. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I ditto your thesis that the great intellectual challenge is the blending of harmonious sociological analysis, which is reason, with that of theological explanation, which is faith. In fact, I just very briefly I'd like to say that for me personally, it has been a privilege to associate with Professor Riaz Hassan, because it has given me a totally new insight into Islam as a religion, not just of faith anymore, but of reason as well. One of my worries earlier on was that Islam has not undergone a reformation like Christianity. So there was no Socratic treatment of Islamic content. No one asked why. It's not an easy question to ask. It takes a lot of courage, it takes a lot of intellectual depth in order to be able to ask that and respond to that query in a way that sort of harmonizes with societal attitudes. I've lived in America as Mr. Berkey does, and in America there's this huge debate in Middle America between creationism and evolution and all that. And on the one hand, you'd think that this is a Protestant society which is so advanced. On the other hand, it's like the breakdown now or whatever stoppage. I mean, it's stuck in this huge debate on whether we have evolved or whether we have been created by God as a particular event.